Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this TSG Meet the Experts panel discussion for strategic considerations of biopesticides and biostimulants. I am so happy you were able to take the time out of your day to join us for this session. My name is Kelly Rahn, and I manage the state office for TSG. I've been with TSG for several years, and prior to joining, held a few different industry regulatory affairs positions spanning more than 30 years. I apologize up front for not having a video feed. I've actually come down with a pretty severe head cold and not knowing completely for sure what it is, was unable to go into the office today where I had my video equipment all set up and ready to go. Our state service office is located in Sacramento, California, right across the park from the California Department of Pesticides. Department of Pesticide Regulation. And although located in California, we provide services in all states for not only biopesticides and biostimulants, but also for all types of pesticides, animal feed, and fertilizing and amending materials. TSG has been providing companies around the world with regulatory guidance and scientific expertise for almost 30 years. We help clients worldwide address the technical and regulatory issues in taking their products to market in multiple jurisdictions. Our scientific expertise, regulatory knowledge, and understanding of local nuances enable our clients to navigate the complex and ever-changing regulatory landscape across the globe. I will now ask that each of our panel members provide an introduction. Shannon, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Kelly. I'm Shannon Bryant-Spas. I'm a senior regulatory consultant with TSG, and I am located in the state office where I focus on fertilizing materials, soil amendments, plant amendments, and organic inputs. And I've been with TSG about 5 years, and before that was with a analytical laboratory for over 20.
Thank you, Shannon. Micah, would you please introduce yourself?
Morning, everybody. My name is Micah Reynolds. I'm Senior Regulatory Consultant with TSG Consulting, based out of our Washington, D.C. office. I've been with TSG for about a little over 10 years, and then prior to that, with another consulting shop. So I've been in the business for about 16 years. Primarily, my roles are working with federal clients on EPA-related projects, whether that is a conventional chemistries, biochemicals, microbials, antimicrobials, repellents, the whole gamut there. I look forward to helping answer your questions today.
Thank you, Micah. Beth, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Beth Mileson. I work at TSG out of the DC office. I'm a toxicologist, and I have spent a lot of time working on biopesticides, working to have registrations with the EPA, and I've been with TSG for almost 20 years now. Hard to believe.
Thank you, Beth. Prior to opening the line to questions, I would like to provide a very brief orientation as to the differences between biopesticides and biostimulants as a framework for the majority of this session, which will be a question and answer. So the logical place to start is with a definition of each of these. A working definition of a biopesticide is a pesticide that contains an active ingredient that is naturally occurring, has a history demonstrative of minimal toxicity, and acts on the target pest in a non-toxic fashion. On the other hand, a biostimulant has no working definition and currently may not be used as a term on product labels or on marketing materials. Another point of differentiation is the registration pathway. The pathway for a biopesticide is well defined. Like any other pesticide, registration is obtained first at US EPA through BPPD, and then state registrations as a pesticide are required in all states. This, however, is not the case for biostimulants. Biostimulants are not registered at the federal level. State registration of these products is required, but the variability state to state is large. This slide lists some of the categories used in the states for these types of products, and each category presents unique challenges that we're going to go through one by one on the next slides. So, a state may regulate a biostimulant as a fertilizer. However, the biostimulant, in order to qualify, will need to contain at least one compound that is a nutrient for the plant at a quantity sufficient to provide a benefit. Not all biostimulants will inherently contain this nutrient component. So if you're not a fertilizer, a state may regulate you as a soil or plant amendment. This category, potentially more so than others, is challenging because the widely accepted definitions for these categories do not exist across the states that regulate them. Additionally, qualifying as a soil or plant amendment is inextricably linked to the mode of action of the product. The mode of action, as well as the substances that play an active role in the mode of action, are notoriously difficult to determine for biopesticides. Another category you could fall into would be the bucket that's biostimulants could be regulated as beneficial substances. This category also has difficulties. The difficulty with regulation under this category is that only a small number of substances are recognized, and for substances to be added as recognized, they must go through a very lengthy APCO definition process. If any of the states you can't fit into any of the categories we just discussed, the default often becomes that your product is in fact a plant growth regulator. Plant growth regulator is a biopesticide, and you circle back to the beginning where you necessitate the need for EPA registration as a biopesticide first at the federal level, and then you need to go out and get your state registrations, which is typically a longer, more expensive pathway to market. So I'd like to quickly turn our focus on just two more items. First, how do we solve what seems to be the problems associated with a system fraught with imperfection? Well, in early 2019, EPA drafted a document for public comment intended to provide insight into how biostimulants fit into the existing available regulatory structure. The main issues with the document revolve around EPA's providing lists of both claims and active ingredients. In a strict reading of the document, these lists were intended as examples and were not intended to be all-inclusive. However, in the absence of any other available guidance, many states have defaulted to reading the lists as comprehensive and all-inclusive, which many believe narrows the playing field that EPA intended to support by issuing the document in the first place. And if that isn't enough, EPA just issued an updated version right before Thanksgiving. There are some significant differences between these documents, and I am sure this will lead to some lively interaction with our panelists momentarily. I will wrap up my comments with a few words on issues that haven't been addressed yet. We've touched on the first two items, which are literal reading of lists that were intended to serve as examples. In addition to this, some states are issuing provisional registrations, which can be revoked if circumstances change, which drive instability in the marketplace. Another remaining issue is that biostimulant is a well-recognized term, but we continue to be prohibited from using it in our marketing materials and on our label. Lastly, a lack of alignment in EPA and USDA's approaches to this situation will continue to yield uncertainty. We are going to move now into taking questions. and we've already received quite a few. I will start with those, but please feel free to send along more questions using the chat feature that Riley mentioned. So the first question I'd like to offer to our panelists: is it true that fertilizers are exempt from FIFRA regulation? And if so, can a seaweed extract be considered a fertilizer?
So I can take that one, at least get started. So fertilizers are exempt under FIFRA. Seaweed extracts could potentially be fertilizers, but they do have to contain a sufficient amount of some recognized plant nutrient to qualify as a fertilizer. Typically, seaweed extract contains very, very low nutrient content, and the largest portion seems to be potassium that comes from the extraction process. So that can be a means to market. We have seen, kind of as an aside, we have seen state regulators really starting to question seaweed extract and what the intent of the product is and whether it really is functioning as a fertilizer.
Thank you, Shannon. Let's move to another question that we've received. I submitted my product to the state as a soil amendment, but was directed to EPA for a determination on the regulatory classification of the product. What's involved in that process?
I'm happy to start with that. Thanks, Kelly. What the state regulator likely asked you to do they can't properly categorize it, and they've asked you to go to EPA for a formal regulatory determination under PREA, and that's in the miscellaneous categories. It's an M009 PREA action. It's not very long, and you get some definitive answer whether you are or are not a pesticide. However, that process is not routinely used, and there's no standard guidance on what you need to submit. The best information that we've been able to get from BPPD in terms of what you need to submit for an M9 action are going to be things like mode of action data. You need to know how your product is going to function and what it's going to do. They'll want copies of your proposed labeling for the product, brand names, claims that you want to make, directions for use, any warning or cautionary statements, details in terms of product use and mode of action, and any kind of supporting information you may have, say data or data saying you're not acting by mode of action that would be a plant growth regulator or something similar. Photographs speak 1,000 words, comparisons to other products, all that stuff is good information to submit. But please be wary that once you make that submission, you can't put the cat back in the bag, so to speak. Once you proceed down that route, be prepared that EPA may want to regulate your product as a PGR, and at that point, you're well within the Section 3 category, and on to data development and registration submission you will go.
Thank you, Micah. I'd like to address, we've gotten a couple of questions from the audience now. This presentation will be made available to all participants after the webinar. So for another question from the audience, are there instances where EPA will say the product is not a plant growth regulator, but the states still require registration as a plant growth regulator?
If you actually have a determination from EPA that you can show to a regulator that your product is not functioning as a PGR, then you should be fine going to a state and saying, this is not a PGR, I have this determination. You still will require some kind of regulation at the state level, depending on what the product actually is, if it's a soil amendment or a fertilizer or a plant amendment. Those still are regulated at the state level, but not as pesticides.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, I'll add quickly to that. That's the flip side of the coin on the M9 PREA determination. If EPA gives you a written justification that you're not regulated by them, then you do have that. You do have that to give to the state regulators, and then there's some definition of what you are or what.
Right. And I'll add a little bit more to that is just from a practical experience kind of view. We have seen state regulators at fertilizer soil amendments starting to ask for that and starting to request that companies that they're not sure of what the product is doing, asking for that that M9 determination.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question. What are the advantages of getting a biopesticide registration over a biostimulant? What is involved in the process? What are the data requirements?
I'll give a start on that one. I think that's kind of a three-step question, but I think one of the advantages to getting a biopesticide classification or registration is that you can make claims that you can't otherwise claim. So, you, for example, you can put on your label that the product stimulates growth or enhances fruit development or that sort of claim, and that may be what your customers are looking for. As far as the process goes, there are a number of data requirements that wouldn't be necessary to fulfill if you weren't registering the substance, but you do need to go through product chemistry and toxicology data requirements. As far as toxicology goes, TSG often helps clients address the toxicology data requirements through data rationales that fulfill the requirement based on public literature rather than actually conducting the study. So there are ways to address data requirements for biochemical pesticides that aren't quite as onerous as for conventional pesticides.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I'll add just briefly to that in terms of, yeah, there's the reduced data set that you can enjoy by not being a conventional pesticide, but conventional herbicide, fungicide, rodenticide, that nature. But there's still the process. There's still that EPA regulatory process to go through. We'd be looking at, fairly nice lead time, depending on if you're a food use or a non-food use type of substance. You're still looking at a long PREA timeframe for registration at BPPD. It could still be over a year to 2 years before you can get a registration.
Thank you, Micah. Another question from the audience. Do states individually decide the nutrient content minimum to classify a biostimulant as a fertilizer? And a similar question that we can probably do kind of 2 in 1. What entity defines a fertilizer level that benefits the plant? I'm an agronomist and am not aware of an industry established standard in this area.
So I can kind of speak to that a little bit. There's no standard for what benefits the plant per se. The states do have limits on minimum nutrient content that can be declared. A lot of that is based on the APSCO process, and that's the American Association of Plant Food Control Officials, which is kind of a group that the control officials belong to, and they share information and try and harmonize process across the states. It's a voluntary organization, so it doesn't have any power to impose that harmonization, but kind of encourages it. There are minimum levels in terms of, especially for something like an agricultural fertilizer. When you get into something like the home and garden market and you're looking at maybe foliar applications, in a ready-to-use product, those levels are much lower, but there are still, and for micronutrients as well, there are minimum requirements. So there are some, states generally follow the minimum set by APCO, but there's some variability there.
Thank you. Another question we've received, do the panelists believe that the M009 procedure will be adopted as the long-term regulatory process for biostimulants?
I didn't see Shannon or Beth unmute, so I'll start. The process remains voluntary at EPA. They're not going to mandate it, but what I think Shannon was saying earlier, that you see state regulators start wanting to expect that that's part of what you're doing in the classification process for what could be a biostimulant. So I think that's the way it's going to go. EPA won't mandate that, but that's the way state regulation may end up pushing this.
I think I'll add to that a little bit. There is a fee associated with that PREA action, and I don't believe that the state regulators can force you to go that route. If you don't care to go that route, that would be where you want to try and put together a good package, a good argument as to why you don't need to. And that would be where you want to be able to explain your mode of action. You want to be able to provide maybe some efficacy data that shows you're not functioning as a PGR, since that's the most typical compound a biostimulant will try it. The regulators will think it might be falling into. And also you want to talk about the claims you're making, because there are dual use products that could be used both as a biostimulant, in other words, a non-pesticidal action, and then may have a pesticidal action either at a higher concentration or in a different use. So you really want to be able to, if you do not want to have to go that PREA route, you want to be able to put together a good argument as to why you shouldn't need to.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question that's just a little bit different than what we've heard so far. What are the notable changes in the newest EPA draft guidance on biostimulants as compared to the original 2019 version?
So I'll start on this one, and maybe different folks have different ideas. But for me, the biggest change from the 2019 document to the most recent one is in the 2019 document, EPA identified a whole list of substances in the infamous Table 4 that basically listed registered plant PGRs, basically, and didn't give any other option for those substances. And in that list were a number of substances that are also considered biostimulants. And so this put the biostimulant folks in a difficult situation, because it sort of looked as though EPA was saying that all of these things need to be registered. For example, on that list was seaweed extract and a lot of other things that could have dual uses. And so in the 2020 guidance, EPA deleted the Table 4 and basically took almost each of the substances on that table and discussed individually why they thought they should be registered, but then acknowledged that in some cases those same substances had dual modes of action, depending upon perhaps how they were applied. For example, foliar application compared to soil application. And so they really did open the door for allowing some of those substances to be in products that were not registered as pesticides. And so I think that's the major difference. They may not have gone as far as people wanted, but they at least acknowledged multiple uses other than pesticides for those substances.
Great, Beth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I wanted to add briefly to that. Yeah, with the table 4 gone, they do say, this subset of active ingredients, they have no substantial commercial use other than as a pesticide. So that meets that 40 CFR 152.15 intent test that we usually talk about. And then they do kind of say some of these AIs, maybe they have a non-PGR use depending on what the claim is. But what's interesting, and I want to read this sentence out of this document here because say it twice. They say it in the middle of page 7 and they say it underneath the table on page 11. When claims for increased or decreased growth, yield, germination, maturation, etc., are consequent to intended uses of products or substances, that's the PGR actions, intended uses of products or substances as plant nutrients, fertilizers, plant inoculants, soil amendments, or other non-pesticide uses, such products and substances may be excluded from regulation under FIFRA in the absence of any plant growth regulator claims. So take that with a grain of salt, and I don't want to read EPA's mind here, but it might suggest, and I leave this for everybody to think about, but if you're going to market a biostimulant or something that has that particular exemption under 152.6, but there might be some other added benefits, let's say, that might increase yield or maturation of fruit or alter physiological processes. Perhaps if you don't claim them and substantiate that you are one of these other categories and it's a fringe benefit, I leave it to industry, but that is an interesting statement that EPA makes in that guidance. So it's worth more discussion.
I think I'll add a little bit to that. I think the biggest thing that I note in that document is EPA is taking a more nuanced approach. And I think that what companies need to be ready to do is, and there's no real guidance in this document that says how you do this, but how do you show that your product is functioning or has benefits as a soil amendment or as a fertilizer or plant amendment, so that it's not just functioning as a PGR. And I think that's the big thing, is a dual use product would have both functions. So the EPA does delineate in that guidance document that these products or these active ingredients have no benefit other than a PGR. So conversely, if you don't want to be one of those, how do you show you do have benefit that is not PGR related? And so, it's going to be interesting to see how industry comes back around, and there's no prescribed tests or studies or anything like that to show that. So what is that going to be based on in terms of you're going to demonstrate that you have non-pesticidal activity? So I think that's going to be a real area of people really having to think about, I have to do actual studies, or I have to show actual data. I have to show efficacy as, for these other uses.
I think that's a really good point, Shannon, that I saw, maybe I just interpreted it this way, but I saw kind of a threat that if you say you're a biostimulant for some of these things, that you're going to need to have data in your pocket that show that your product is effective in helping the plant get through a drought or elevated temperatures or something like that. And if you don't, then they're going to think that you are a pesticide. And so how do you develop those data and exactly what you said? What does EPA want when they ask you for those supporting data? So I think that's a really good point.
So it's interesting, Beth, that you said that, because we have another question from the audience that is about this very thing. Is there any sufficient guidance on efficacy trials with respect to supporting biostimulant claims, such as abiotic stress tolerance? This questioner says, I've only seen EU guidance, but curious if the states have been following any guidelines that utilize greenhouse data or anything else.
Well, I'll take a first pass at that. The states do not have guidance at this time for something that's strictly a biostimulant. There are selected states that have guidance for soil amendments, or plant amendments. There's a few states that have extensive guidance. Illinois comes to mind. But it doesn't specifically address biostimulant claims. So Illinois is one of those states that wants data for their conditions, their growing conditions. And that generally is what the states are looking for when they have this kind of guidance. And Illinois has this guidance published on their website, so if you wanted to grab it. But it's related to showing that the product will be functional in their environment. And they are field trials. They're not looking for greenhouse data per se. For this purpose. So they're looking for their conditions. Some states are even the crops that are grown in their states. And it's not based on abiotic stress or anything like that. So they don't really have anything right now. I know that industry is working on some options for how you prove that, but the states, at least at this point, haven't adopted anything.
Okay, thank you. A slightly different question. We have a product that is used as an additive to an inoculant to improve the microbial survival. Apologies, I just lost it. To improve the microbial survival and enhance the root or rhizosphere colonization. Can this product be classified as a biostimulant? And if so, does it now need to be registered?
That sounds like it might be coming my way as well. So technically, in the U.S., nothing is qualified as a biostimulant. We mentioned earlier there's no accepted regulatory definition at this time. So you don't have that option. You could be registered in the states as a soil amendment. I have seen products that are registered as, depending on what your content is, microbial food, or something that assists the biosphere, basically. And so, yes, you would still need to be registered in the states. Not every state has a soil amendment law, so you don't require registration everywhere, but it's a fairly good, substantial portion of the states. It's roughly 30 require registration as a soil amendment. And so that would be your path.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Do any of the panelists know off the top of their head the PREA fee for an M009?
That would be for FY 2020 and 2021. It's $2,482, and that is subject to small business considerations if you have fewer than 500 employees and global gross revenues from pesticide sales less than $10 million. You qualify for 75% off that fee.
Great, thank you. A question surrounding enforcement. The questioner says, there is nothing in the draft guidance that discusses enforcement. So is EPA assuming that all PGR companies will be on the honor system? EPA certainly does not have the staff to track down and enforce this. Micah, have you heard anything about enforcement?
I'll start. I haven't heard anything in terms of enforcement. I would believe that the guidance is the guidance, and that it's incumbent upon the registrant or the industry community to abide by it, or ask questions, or file determinations, or use it as a negotiation point with the states. I think when FIFRA puts the primary enforcement tool to the states, I think there's going to be, to Shannon's point earlier, if you don't want to pursue the determination under PREA, then you have to have a very solid watertight case as to under which category you may be classified, and hopefully the state will agree with you, and then in turn you could have multiple opinions on that.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'll add too, I'm supposed to just be moderating, but I think where we're going to see the enforcement on this is at the state level. The states have super strong opinions about whether a product should be registered or not. And if they feel that the product should have been registered in their state as a biopesticide, they are not going to be shy about finding people if they can do it and generating some income that way.
Well, and to that point, I think what we're starting to see and what we have seen over the past few years is a coordination between the regulators that work on fertilizers and soil amendments and the regulators that work on pesticides, where we've seen the fertilizer soil amending community send the product over to the pesticide department. Sometimes it's actually the same person, but in many states they're separate, and ask for a determination. And typically what we've seen is at that point, the regulator from the pesticidal side will say, prove to me, show me that it's not. Do you have something from EPA that says it's not? And so it's kind of a circular argument, but I agree, the enforcement's going to be at the state level, and that the regulators are well aware of this category of products, and they are becoming increasingly concerned that things are being, some of them are sure that things are being sold basically under the table, that they're not, that what's being claimed or is not what the product's actually intended to do. So there's a lot more scrutiny, even in states that don't say regulate soil amendments. There's a lot more scrutiny on these products.
Okay. I have had a couple questions along this vein, more of housekeeping. Who should I try to reach out to at TSG to just start a discussion for assistance with these registrations? The last slide in the slide deck that'll be shared after the webinar is over is going to have the contact information for all of us on it, at least the email address, so it's easy to get in touch with us, and please feel free. Another question, how does California Department of Pesticide Regulation view the guidance document? Shannon, if you'd like to start that one, I'd be happy to say a few words myself after you.
Well, I can't really speak to DPR, but I can speak to the California Department of Food and Agriculture, which is the department that regulates fertilizers and soil amendments. And they have some concerns. There's a category of product registration in California that's an auxiliary soil and plant substance. It's an ASPS. And their products have been allowed to be registered there, that there's actually some discrepancy between that kind of a product registration in California and the guidance document. So I know that CDFA intends to make comments on the guidance document to EPA.
And let me say a word about Department of Pesticide Regulation, who I deal with very frequently. California often gets a bad rap as far as being a difficult state to work with and difficult to get your products registered. But one thing California has going for them is they are scientist heavy, and they tend to be extremely reasonable. So if there was one state where I had some data to support that something that could be a pesticidal active, actually has non-pesticidal function, I'd go to California willingly, because out of everybody, I feel like that's where I'm going to get the traction if I have the sound science to kind of sell my position. I find them to be very, very reasonable in that regard. All right, we have a question. Hold on a second. My mouse scroller is a little bit overreactive here. Have you seen significant pushback from states concerning seaweed and plant extract registration since the draft guidance from 2019? Is it expected now that states won't register these products without EPA consultation?
I'll take a stab at that one. The answer is yes, we have seen increased scrutiny. No, the states aren't refusing to register the products and are not necessarily requiring some kind of an EPA document saying that you're not a PGR. What we have seen is states requiring more information. So you can't just go in and say, register my product. They are more aware of these concerns, and so they're more likely to scrutinize your claims. They're more likely to ask questions. Seaweed extract has not, to my knowledge, been rejected outright for registration anywhere. There are a lot of questions. I've seen seaweed extracts registered as fertilizers based on being extracted with potassium hydroxide, and so there's a nutrient content there. What you end up doing is having to clarify that that nutrient content is coming from your seaweed extract because it was extracted with potassium hydroxide. There's just more awareness, I'd say. I wouldn't say that they're automatically rejecting those products, but there is definitely more awareness and definitely more of a focus on what kind of claims you're making.
Thank you. Call out real quick for Shannon. Thanks for the great answers, Shannon. TSG will have to issue Shannon dark sunglasses and a floppy hat if she goes to an airport. All right. Please clarify, does the EPA definition of biopesticide really require that the material be non-toxic to pests?
I'll take a stab at that. So it doesn't say that it has to be non-toxic to pests. It has to act by a non-toxic mode of action. So for example, some of the biochemical pesticides cause the outer shell of an insect to become permeable, and that causes evaporation of the moisture inside the body, and the insects die. While other, say, natural substances, like there's an extract of some plant roots called rotenone that's extremely toxic, and it's used to trap fish, which is kind of odd because it's not allowed to be used as a biochemical pesticide, but it does stun the fish, and so they can grab them out and then do some tests on them and put them back in the water before they die. But it can't be a biochemical pesticide. It's a conventional pesticide. And so there's a distinction. It can't, pyrethrin, for example, is also naturally occurring in chrysanthemums, but it's not a biochemical pesticide. It's a conventional pesticide. So that's the distinction. It has to have a mode of action that isn't neurotoxic, for example. It's more mechanical than specifically toxic.
Thank you, Beth. I have another question. I'm already registered as a biostimulant in several places outside of the U.S. Why can't I register as a biostimulant in the U.S.? Isn't there any kind of reciprocity or advantage to being registered in a different country?
think Shannon and I unmuted at the same time. I was just going to say, no, you still have to go through the process here. If you feel you have a strong case that you're a biostimulant, or again fit in one of the exempted categories in 40 CFR 152.6, that's fantastic. You may have supporting data already or information from, say, trials done in the EU, or have some historical knowledge on the use and functionality of your formulation that you can take and then use in the state registration process here, but you still have to go through the process. There's no reciprocity and to say, well, I'm registered over there as this, can I over here? That's our state regulators here, and EPA will still make their own decisions.
Yeah, and actually, if you're registered as a biostimulant somewhere else, that it actually can cause some issues when you go to register at the state level, mainly because the regulators tend to do Google searches, and if it's the same product name, biostimulants just right now, and it has been for several years, it's a trigger word. The states are very cautious about that word. So not only are you not allowed to use it on your labels or in your marketing, but if they see it anywhere associated with your product, when they do a Google search, then they start to ask additional questions, which if you have data to support that, that's great, but not everybody does. And so that there's more questions raised because of that term. And I should say that there is a proposed definition for the term biostimulants. It was put into the Farm Bill last year or the year before. And so it's circulating, but when you go to the states, they'll still say that's not defined, that's not accepted, that's not approved, that's not regulation yet. And so it just is like I said, it's a trigger word. And so you have to be very, very careful.
Great, thank you. Is the definition of PGR changing and or being more scrutinized?
I'll take a stab at that one. Now, it's not changing. The definition of PGR and as codified in FIFRA and the regulations, and then also the EPA restates it in the guidance document, that's not changing. It's still something that enhances, promotes, or delays growth or onset of fruit, maturation of fruit, or changes the plant physiologically. That's not changing. I think what EPA is trying to do in the document, for better or worse, is try to explain, okay, here are the typical claims that we get that are plant inoculant related or soil amendment related or plant amendment related. Here's the claims that we see that are all the time plant growth regulator. And then here's some that are just generally non-pesticidal. And then it's left up to the rest of us to manage that and look at the claims that you want to make on your product. So practically speaking, the PGR definition remains unchanged, but EPA has tried to clarify some things with this guidance.
Yeah, I think I'll add a little bit more to that. I think it's trying to emphasize that there are other products that some of them have the same effects, increased yield. I mean, fertilizers have the effect of increased yield. So soil amendments, other things can have some of those same effects. I mean, there's some that are clearly only PGR. So some of those can have the same effects. You just have to be able to show that you actually are one of those and not something that's, only a PGR.
Right. We are at 4 minutes left in our session. I think it's time for me to just kind of toss out the final question that we'll be able to take today. Similar to seaweed containing phytohormones and other phytohormone-like plant growth substances, L-glutamic acid and GABA can be found in APFCO-recognized nitrogen sources. Does EPA intend on regulating these and other sources of amino acids?
let me start with that one. I think it depends upon the claims that you want to have for your product and the mode of action that are also claimed for the product. If GABA and related substances are said to stimulate growth, then yes, EPA would consider that a plant growth regulator and therefore a pesticide.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I'll add briefly to that. Just like what EPA did with the infamous Table 4 in the 2019 guidance, where they listed the particular active ingredients that they recognize as plant growth regulators, in the revised guidance from a couple weeks ago, they do still call out L-glutamic and GABA as what they recognize as a PGR active. I mean, so you kind of know how you're labeled there with the agency, but I would still suggest that if you feel like you have a strong case that you've got something there and it's not working as a PGR, consider that M9 PREA action and submit a data package to support your determination, because it's not, again, this is just guidance, and EPA may have put its feet in the sand, so a state regulator will now see this, and to Shannon's point earlier, we'll use it as definitive guidance and policy. So I would still suggest, yeah, if you can't get any worse. You know EPA is classified you as a PGR active, but if you feel strongly otherwise, it's probably a small investment to get a determination and see where things fall out.
And I think just a little bit more to that point, and I know we're running out of time. States do recognize amino acids as sources of nitrogen. However, most states are not willing to accept, say, naturally occurring, say, fermentation processes that produce amino acids that are nitrogen containing, because they feel that those are doing other things. So when you're going to claim an amino acid on a fertilizer label, it has to be added, especially, say, in California, you have to add that material, and you have to demonstrate to the state that you bought it from somewhere. And so they're not looking at, say, naturally occurring fermentation media type things or any of those kinds of things. They're looking for a different way of using an amino acid or a different means of obtaining it.
Thank you. We are literally 30 seconds from our end time, and I'm not certain if we will cut off automatically or not. So given the possibility that we might be, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And please feel free to contact TSG using the contact information you'll be given in the presentation that we'll send to you after if you have further questions, as I recognize we weren't able to get to everybody today. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.